Greetings all. This is 15 minutes or less with the professor. I'm your host, Professor Keys, and I will discuss ego defense mechanisms again on this episode and several more in the future. I'm going to read two short essays. The first is the analogy between takedown defense and MMA and preventing the ego from trapping us inside of it. The second is ego defense mechanisms, cut them off variety, which is reference to a perpetrator's propensity to cut people off often when exhibiting this particular ego defense mechanism. Lastly, I will read an excerpt from one of the many letters to prison I have written over the years. In tribute to the late great legendary boxing referee Mills Lane, let's get it on. The analogy between takedown defense and MMA and preventing the ego from trapping us inside of it. Trapped inside of our ego is a place we do not want to live. It's a pathetic existence. Here we go. In mixed martial arts fighting, some fighters' strength is known as stand-up, which means the fighter has good boxing skills. Other fighters lack boxing skills but have a strong ground game, which usually entails wrestling and jiu-jitsu skills. Takedown defense keeps the fight in stand-up mode and prevents it from going to the ground. Fighters with strong stand-up skills wants to keep the fight off the ground, and the fighters who lack stand-up skills but excel on the ground attempt to get the stand-up fighter down on the ground. Ego defense mechanisms are issues of emotional immaturity. Some of the characteristics include defensive denial, distortion, subjective suppositions, projection, and projecting narcissism. These characteristics are learned through an unconscious conditioning process. Gary Null asserts, quote, "The ego will defend everything in your belief system, especially the flaws," unquote. These circumstances make it vital that we exhibit self-reflection. Otherwise, we will maintain the flaws in our belief systems. Failure to self-reflect occurs when our egos succeed in trapping us inside them. The battle we wage against our egos consists of us executing takedown defense to prevent the ego from pulling us inside of it and trapping us there. In mixed martial arts, if the fight goes to the ground, the fighter with good stand-up skills is usually the victim of a vicious ground and pound assault. Likewise, when we lose the battle to remain outside of our egos and instead get trapped inside them, we suffer a similar brutal ground and pound beat down assault at the hands of our egos. Next essay. Ego defense mechanisms, cut them off variety. When a person exhibits the characteristics of ego defense mechanisms, usually it's done unconsciously. However, there are instances when they are practiced consciously, as is the case when lawyers or talk show hosts practice them. An example is Donald Trump and infamous deceased powerful lawyer Roy Cohn. Before Trump met and hired Roy Cohn, Trump practiced ego defense mechanisms unconsciously. Roy Cohn taught Trump to practice them consciously. Some of the characteristics of ego defense mechanism consist of the following: deny the truth and then distort the truth. In the process, there are other subcategories implemented, including subjective suppositions, which is to strategically focus on a particular word or a phrase that you can pull out of context in order to change the point, which in essence distorts the truth, as opposed to reflecting on a point that is being made and taking time to think about it before replying. A good example of the execution of subjective suppositions is shown in how people can use statistics to deceive their audience. This is accomplished by presenting raw data and while interpreting what that raw data represents, the person excludes important variables that can change the point or the effect of what that data truly means. For example, according to statistics, more white people are killed by police than blacks. However, when you include the important variables that there are approximately 300 million whites and only about 30 million blacks in the United States, or that whites make up 62% of the population compared to 12% for blacks. When you calculate those variables, more blacks are killed by police than whites at a ratio of 5 to 1. Next, there is projection, which is when the projecting party takes their own frailties and liabilities or flaws and projects those onto their projective target. The most common example of this is when a person with narcissistic tendencies accuses their target of being a narcissist. Also, the projecting party demotes and degrades his projective target as he enhances his own self-perception and self-image with the desired outcome to deny and distort the truth. Finally, the projecting narcissist. Projecting narcissist is the most insolent of the subcategories. The projecting narcissist perceives everything as a personal attack, whether real or imagined. Therefore, the projecting narcissist is very defensive, and in that defensive paranoid state becomes very offensive. The projecting narcissist resorts to a fusillade of insults with the recurring theme of devaluing the opinions, observations, and self-worth of the projected target while overvaluing his own opinions, observations, and self-worth. Also, the projecting narcissist will constantly cut off his projective target to prevent him from completing his thoughts and finalizing his points. Finally, the following is an excerpt from one of the many letters I wrote to prison, and it is explaining ego defense mechanisms, especially subjective suppositions. This is when Obama was running for president and was pressured to distance himself from Reverend Jeremiah Wright and Minister Louis Farrakhan. Here we go. Letters to prison. Reverend Flieger and Fox 5 News. When I got out of bed this morning, I turned on the radio. Of course, it was non-corporate media, 99.5 FM, WBAI. And they were playing this interview of Reverend Flieger. It was a commentator from Fox 5 interviewing him, and the commentator was asking him questions about Reverend Jeremiah Wright and Minister Louis Farrakhan. Reverend Flieger is a Caucasian brother, and he is very close friends with Reverend Wright and Minister Farrakhan. The Fox commentator was trying to demonize Reverend Wright and Minister Farrakhan, but Reverend Flieger wasn't having it. The Fox commentator said that Reverend Wright and Minister Farrakhan preached hate and they hated the United States, but Reverend Flieger disagreed with him. Reverend Flieger explained to the commentator that he knew Farrakhan and Wright personally and that the Fox commentator didn't. He explained to the commentator that he, Farrakhan, and Wright weren't running for any political office. He said that they all were ministers running for Jesus, and they all have a duty to oppose the evils and ills of the society, and especially the evils and ills of the government. The commentator then tried to use Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. against Minister Farrakhan and Reverend Wright when he quoted a sentence from one of Dr. King's speeches and then said that Dr. King preached a message of love and that these guys preach a message of hate. Reverend Flieger told the commentator that he needed to read the first paragraph of that speech of Dr. King's that he just quoted, and then told him that he needed to read Dr. King's speech on why he opposed the Vietnam War. The commentator didn't say anything, and Reverend Flieger told him that he needed to read Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham jail and needed to read Dr. King's speech, "I've been to the mountaintop." The commentator stayed quiet, and Reverend Fleeger kept going off. He said that Dr. King was being very critical of the United States in all of those speeches, and then said that the media tries to repackage Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. by only presenting an image of him that is acceptable to their type of thinking. But the truth is that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was extremely critical of the racism and other injustices that this government is guilty of, and that is why they ultimately assassinated him. Reverend Fleeger was sharp in recognizing subjective suppositions and the characteristics of ego defense mechanisms. Anybody that is doing something wrong and is trying to get away with it will resort to ego defense mechanisms when someone else tries to catch them and expose what they are doing. This happens on every level of society, from small children to grown adults, from petty street criminals up to the George Bush and his criminal administration. A subjective supposition is the main tool used by those with ego defense mechanisms. A subjective supposition is when you take one piece of a sentence, a paragraph, or a speech, and then you pull it out of the sentence or the paragraph or the speech. You ignore all the other words that are in the sentence, the paragraph, or speech, and then you change the point. You try to make the point mean something different than what it meant when it was together with all the other words that you chose to ignore. This is what the commentators on Fox and several other corporate controlled media outlets do on a regular basis. They frustrate people because people know that they're being manipulated but don't realize exactly how they are doing it. Reverend Fleeger was too nice for this dude though, and he kept catching him out there. It got to the point where it was so obvious that it became embarrassing for the Fox commentator, and he decided that he didn't want to mess with Reverend Fleeger anymore. When you're able to catch someone out there doing this, you will notice that you will constantly have to say to them, that's not the point, because they will constantly keep trying to change the point. They will keep doing this because if they stick to the point, they may as well admit that they are guilty or that they are wrong. Here's a quote from Malcolm X talking about subjective suppositions, but he also includes projection, which is another ego defense mechanism that works closely with subjective suppositions. He said, quote, "They take one word out of what I say, ignore all the rest, then project me in an image that's not true, and I'm very used to that," unquote. Thank you for having an audience with me. I hope to see you at the next one. Signing off.